Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be invisible in a room full of people who see you perfectly well? To be the joke whispered behind hands, the cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters? Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more amazing stories tomorrow. Also, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let's continue with the story. The summer heat pressed down on Copper Ridge like a heavy wool blanket as Josephine Brennan stood frozen behind the Miller family's barn. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd simply been returning the bridle she'd repaired for Thomas Miller, the eldest son, when she heard the voices drifting through the weathered slats. "Pa's losing his mind if he thinks I'd court that Brennan girl." Thomas's voice carried the easy cruelty of someone who'd never known rejection. "I'd rather marry a mule. At least a mule's useful and doesn't make children hide their faces." His brothers erupted in laughter, and Joe felt something inside her chest crack like thin ice under a boot. This wasn't the first time. This wasn't even the worst thing she'd heard. But something about hearing it from Thomas, who'd once been kind to her when they were children before he learned that kindness toward the marked girl came with social consequences, made her hands shake. The port wine birthmark that covered the left side of her face and snaked down her neck had been her companion since birth. Her mother used to call it her map to somewhere special, tracing the dark purple patterns with gentle fingers. But her mother had been dead 6 years now, and the rest of Copper Ridge saw it as something else entirely. A curse. A mark of God's displeasure. A reason to look away. Joe dropped the bridle in the dirt and walked back toward her family's ranch, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not where anyone could see. The Brennan Ranch sat 2 miles outside town, far enough that most folks only visited when they needed something. Right now, that suited Joe just fine. Her father, Samuel Brennan, was waiting on the porch, and she could read the hope in his weathered face before he even spoke. Did Thomas seem receptive? Joe pushed past him without answering, heading straight for the stables. The familiar smell of hay and leather wrapped around her like a comfort she couldn't find anywhere else. Here, among the horses, nobody cared about the stain on her skin. They saw her hands, her voice, her patience. They saw her. "Joe, sweetheart, we need to talk about this." Her father's voice followed her, heavy with desperation she pretended not to hear. She knew what he needed to say. The ranch was failing, cattle prices had dropped, they needed an alliance, a marriage that could bring money or connections or both. And she was 24 years old, unmarried, with no prospects and a face that made men turn away. She was supposed to be grateful for any attention, any offer, any chance. But she wasn't grateful. She was tired. And as she reached for the pitchfork to muck out the stalls, the only place where her hands mattered more than her face, she wondered how much longer she could keep pretending that being invisible didn't hurt. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm. The midnight screaming of horses shattered Joe's restless sleep. She bolted upright, her heart hammering as hooves struck wood with the force of gunshots. The entire stable seemed to shake on its foundation. She grabbed her father's old revolver from beneath her pillow and ran barefoot into the yard, her nightdress whipping around her legs. Every horse in the stable was losing their minds. Their terror was contagious, spreading like wildfire as they kicked and reared against their stalls. But the sound that made her blood run cold was the splintering crack of timber coming from the main corral. A massive black shape moved in the darkness, and for a moment Joe thought it was a bear. Then lightning split the sky and she saw him properly. The stallion stood nearly 17 hands high, his coat so black it seemed to swallow moonlight. An Appaloosa with white spots scattered across his hindquarters like stars thrown against midnight. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Pure rage and something worse, pain that had turned into fury. The horse dealer stood by his wagon counting money while her father looked on. Samuel Brennan's face was pale in the lamplight. "That's Diablo," the dealer said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Killed 2 handlers in Laramie, put another man in a wheelchair for life. Nobody can touch him. Nobody can ride him. But if you can break him, you'll have the finest stud this territory's ever seen. I'm practically giving him away." "How much?" Her father's voice was desperate. $50, and you haul him off tonight." Joe watched her father count out bills with shaking hands. $50 they didn't have. $50 that should have gone to paying off the feed store debt. Her father was gambling everything on an animal that would likely kill whoever came near it. Diablo charged the corral fence, his massive body slamming into the rails with enough force to splinter wood. The sound echoed across the ranch like thunder. He screamed, a sound of pure rage that made every horse on the property answer in terror. "Pa, you can't be serious," Joe said, stepping forward. "That horse is a killer." "That horse is our future," her father snapped. "If we can break him, breed him, we could save this ranch. Every cattleman from here to Billings would pay for his foals." The dealer was already climbing onto his wagon, eager to be gone before anyone changed their mind. "Good luck," he called over his shoulder. "You're going to need it. Nobody's ever gotten within 10 feet of that devil without bleeding." Joe approached the corral slowly, holding the lantern high. Diablo stood. In the center, sides heaving, nostrils flared. She could see the old scars now, whip marks across his shoulders, a brand on his left flank that had healed badly, the skin puckered and angry. Someone had hurt this horse so badly that trust had become impossible. "Joe, get away from there," her father ordered. But she couldn't move. Something in those wild eyes called to her. She understood rage born from pain. She understood what it meant to be judged for things beyond your control. This wasn't a killer horse. This was a horse that had learned killing was the only way to survive. Diablo charged the fence again, his teeth bared, his eyes rolling white. The rails groaned, but held. Joe stood perfectly still, meeting his gaze through the rough timber. "I know," she whispered, too quiet for anyone but the horse to hear. "I know what they did to you." The stallion snorted, backing away into the shadows. But for just a moment, his ears had flicked forward, listening. "That horse needs to be put down before it kills someone." The voice cut through the morning air like a knife. Joe paused at the barn entrance, her arms full of fresh hay. A crowd had gathered at the ranch house. Wagons lined the dirt path, horses tied to every available post. It seemed half of Copper Ridge had arrived to witness the disaster her father had purchased. At the center of the crowd stood Jackson Wade. Even covered in trail dust, he looked like he'd stepped from a dime novel. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled just above his collar. His clothes were finer than anything most folks in Copper Ridge could afford, marking him clearly as the mine owner's son. Beside him stood Victoria Ashford, her silk dress impractical and pristine, her blonde hair arranged in perfect ringlets. "Mr. Brennan, I came as soon as I heard," Jackson was saying. "That stallion killed a man in Wyoming last month, tore him apart. Keeping him here puts everyone at risk." Samuel Brennan stood on the porch, looking older than his 50 years. "The horse stays. We paid for him." "Then you paid for a funeral," Victoria said sweetly, her voice dripping with concern that felt as genuine as fool's gold. She spotted Joe by the barn and her expression shifted to something between pity and disgust. "Oh, that poor creature. Someone should warn her to stay away from dangerous animals." Joe felt her face flush hot. The birthmark seemed to burn under Victoria's gaze. "The horse or the girl?" someone in the crowd muttered, followed by nervous laughter. Jackson's eyes found Joe across the yard and something flickered in his expression. Not pity, not disgust. Something else entirely. He studied her the way someone might study a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. It made her want to hide and stand straighter at the same time. "Miss Brennan," Jackson called out, his voice carrying authority despite his youth. "Have you approached the animal?" Every head turned toward her. Joe wanted to drop the hay and run. Instead, she lifted her chin. "Last night, briefly." "And you still have all your fingers?" Victoria laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "How fortunate." "What did you observe?" Jackson asked, ignoring his fiancée. He moved closer, his attention fixed on Joe in a way that made her throat tight. "Scars," Joe said quietly. "Old whip marks. A bad brand. That horse isn't mean. He's been tortured." "Tortured animals are the most dangerous kind," Jackson replied, but his tone wasn't dismissive. "They can't distinguish between threat and kindness anymore. Everything becomes an attack to defend against." "Maybe he just needs someone to prove otherwise," Joe said. Their eyes met and held. For a moment the crowd faded away. Then Victoria was there, her gloved hand possessive on Jackson's arm. "Darling, we should go. The smell here is quite overwhelming." Her nose wrinkled delicately. "And Father expects us for lunch. We can't help people who won't accept sensible advice." Jackson allowed himself to be led away, but he glanced back twice before climbing into his carriage. Joe stood frozen, watching them disappear down the road in a cloud of dust. When the crowd finally dispersed, carrying their gossip back to town, Joe walked to Diablo's corral. The stallion stood in the far corner, sides heaving with exhaustion from a night of fighting invisible enemies. "They think you're beyond saving," she told him softly. "Funny, they think the same about me." Joe sat in the dirt outside Diablo's corral at dawn, a book of poetry open in her lap. She'd been there for an hour, reading aloud while the stallion paced and snorted at the far end of the enclosure. "The world is too much with us, late and soon," she read, her voice steady despite the horse's agitation. "Getting and spending we lay waste our powers." Diablo charged the fence, stopping just short of impact. His hooves threw up clouds of dust. Joe didn't flinch. She simply turned the page. "Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon." This had become her morning ritual. Every day for 3 weeks, she'd arrive before sunrise with her mother's old poetry books. She never tried to enter the corral, never reached through the rails. She just sat and read, letting her voice become part of the landscape like wind through grass or the distant call of crows. Her father thought she was wasting time. The ranch hands whispered that grief had finally broken her mind. But Joe had noticed something they hadn't. Each day, Diablo's charges came a little less frequently. His ears tracked her voice even when his eyes looked away. Yesterday, he'd stood only 15 feet from the fence while she read, close enough that she could see his ribs expanding with each breath. "You know what loneliness feels like, don't you?" Joe said, setting the book aside. "Being caged by what people did to you. Having everyone expect the worst because that's all they've ever seen." Diablo's ears swiveled toward her voice. He took 3 steps closer, then stopped, his whole body tense with the conflict between curiosity and fear. Joe reached into her pocket and pulled out an apple. She'd brought one every day for 3 weeks. Every day it had rotted in the sun, untouched. Today she placed it on the ground inside the fence, pushing it through the gap at the bottom rail. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "No whips, no ropes, no expectations, just this." She returned to her spot and opened the book again, reading as the sun climbed higher. An hour passed, then 2. Her throat grew dry, but she kept reading, kept her voice calm and steady. Finally, she heard the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. Through her lowered lashes, she watched Diablo approach the apple. His nostrils flared, testing for danger, his muscles coiled, ready to bolt. But slowly, so slowly it seemed to take forever, he lowered his massive head and took the apple between his teeth. Joe's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to remain still. She turned another page, her voice never wavering, as if a miracle hadn't just happened 3 feet away. "For this, for everything, we are out of tune," she read. "It moves us not." But it moved her. When Diablo didn't run, when he stood there chewing that apple while watching her with one dark eye, something shifted in the air between them. Not trust, not yet, but possibility. The next morning she brought 2 apples. Joe pressed the herbal poultice against Diablo's infected brand through the fence rails, her fingers inches from teeth that could snap bone. The stallion trembled but held still, his breath hot against her wrist. 6 weeks had passed since that first apple. 6 weeks of gradual progress measured in inches and heartbeats. Now she could touch him through the fence, could treat the wounds that had festered for years beneath his rage. The brand on his flank had turned ugly, swollen and weeping. Without treatment, it would kill him slowly. "Easy," she murmured, spreading the mixture of yarrow and comfrey across the inflamed skin. "I know it hurts." Diablo's muscles twitched beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. This was their 3rd treatment session, and each time he trusted her a little more. Each time the distance between them shrank. The sound of hooves and wagon wheels interrupted the morning quiet. Joe looked up to see a procession forming on the road. Not just 1 or 2 visitors, dozens. Word had spread through the territory about the demon horse and the marked girl. People lined up along the fence, pointing and whispering. Some had brought their children, turning Joe's work into a spectacle. She recognized faces from town, from neighboring ranches, from as far as Helena. They'd come to watch like she was performing in a circus. "Look at that," someone said. "She's got her hand right on him." "Unnatural," another voice muttered. "Girl like that working devil's magic on a devil's horse." Joe's hand trembled with humiliation, but she forced herself to continue. Diablo needed this treatment whether or not she had an audience. She reached through the rails again with the poultice. "Miss Brennan." Jackson Wade's voice cut through the crowd. He was there on horseback, Victoria nowhere in sight this time. That's remarkable progress. Joe didn't answer. She couldn't trust her voice not to break. Jackson dismounted and approached the fence, ignoring the crowd's warnings. He studied Diablo with the careful attention of someone who actually understood horses. That brand is from the Triple Cross Ranch in Wyoming. They went bankrupt 2 years ago. Owner was known for brutality. I know, Joe said quietly, finishing her work and stepping back. The scars tell the story. How long before he's healed enough to ride? Ride? Joe laughed bitterly. He's not a show horse, Mr. Wade, and I'm not trying to break him for entertainment. I didn't suggest you were. Jackson's eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. I'm asking because I want to invest. Your father's ranch needs capital. This horse could provide it if people see what he's capable of becoming. He's capable of trust, Joe said. That's more valuable than any stud fee. Then prove it. Jackson pulled a folded paper from his coat. There's a territorial horse show in 6 weeks. First prize is $300. More importantly, every rancher in Montana will be there. One demonstration, Miss Brennan. Show them what patience and kindness can accomplish. Joe looked at Diablo, who watched Jackson with wary but not hostile eyes. $300 could save the ranch. But more than that, it could prove something. That broken things could heal. That monsters were made, not born. I'll think about it, she said. The barn's on fire. The scream tore through the night like a knife. Joe bolted from her bed, her feet hitting the floor before she was fully awake. Orange light flickered through her window, painting shadows across the walls. She ran outside in her nightdress, her lungs already burning from smoke carried on the wind. Lightning had struck the old hay barn. Flames climbed the wooden structure, crackling and roaring like a living beast. Her father and the 2 ranch hands were already working the pump, but the water barely made a dent. The horses in the nearby stable screamed in terror, their panic feeding on itself. Get them out, her father shouted. Open the stalls. Joe ran for the stable, throwing open the doors. Smoke poured through the opening, thick and choking. She pulled her nightdress over her mouth and plunged inside. The horses reared and kicked, wild with fear. She opened stall after stall, guiding each animal toward the exit, her eyes streaming tears from the smoke. Then she remembered. Diablo. His corral sat between the burning barn and the stable, flames already licking at the wooden rails. She ran through the chaos, coughing, her bare feet bleeding from rocks and splinters. The corral gate was jammed, warped from heat and panic. Diablo threw himself against the far fence, his screams cutting through the roar of fire. The flames had reached his water trough. In minutes, the whole structure would collapse. Leave it, her father yelled from somewhere behind her. That horse is too dangerous. Let it go. Joe grabbed an axe from the tool shed and ran back to the gate. She swung hard, again and again, splintering the wood. Splinters bit into her hands. Smoke filled her lungs. The heat was unbearable, like standing inside an oven. The gate finally gave way with a crack. She threw it open and stepped inside the corral, into Diablo's space for the first time. The stallion stood cornered, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with terror. Behind him, the fence was beginning to burn. Please, Joe whispered, extending her hand. Please trust me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Diablo didn't move. Fire crept closer. Timber groaned overhead. Then the stallion took one step toward her, then another, his massive head lowered, his muzzle touching her outstretched palm. Joe grabbed his mane, her voice breaking. Come on, come with me. She walked backward toward the gate, her hand tangled in his mane. Diablo followed, his body trembling but his trust holding. They cleared the corral just as the back fence collapsed in an explosion of sparks and flame. Someone pulled Joe away from the heat. Strong hands steadied her as her knees buckled. Through the smoke and tears, she saw Jackson Wade, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with something between fear and awe. I saw, he said, his voice rough. I saw what you did. Diablo stood beside them, his head lowered to Joe's shoulder, breathing hard, but calm. Around them, the barn collapsed in a shower of embers, but they were safe. All of them. Safe. Joe sat on Diablo's back for the first time, her heart thundering so loud she was certain the entire territory could hear it. 2 weeks had passed since the fire. 2 weeks of Diablo following her like a shadow, of trust building into something solid. Now, in the early morning light, she'd finally climbed onto his back from the fence rail. No saddle, no bridle. Just her legs against his sides and her fingers twisted in his mane. Diablo stood perfectly still, his muscles tense but controlled, waiting, trusting. "Good boy," Joe whispered, barely breathing. "We're going to be just fine." She pressed her heels gently against his sides. Diablo took one step forward, then another. They moved together across the corral in a slow walk, and Joe felt tears streaming down her face. Not from fear, from joy so pure it hurt. By afternoon, word had spread, again. Ranchers arrived from 3 counties to see the impossible. The killer Stallion, ridden bareback by a woman no man would marry. Money began changing hands, contracts signed. Every rancher wanted their best mares bred to Diablo. Her father's eyes shone with relief as he counted offers that would save the ranch twice over. But it was Jackson Wade's attention that made Joe's stomach twist with confusion. He came every day now, always with some excuse. Checking on business with her father, discussing breeding contracts, bringing news from town. Yet his eyes followed her, studying her in a way that made her feel exposed and seen all at once. Then one morning, he arrived alone. No Victoria, no carriage, just Jackson on horseback, dressed simply for once, the mine owner's son looking almost like an ordinary man. "Miss Brennan," he said, dismounting. "I need to speak with you." Joe's defenses rose immediately. "If this is about breeding fees, talk to my father." "It's not." Jackson approached slowly, the way she'd taught him to move around Diablo. "I've ended my engagement to Victoria." The words hit Joe like a physical blow. She stepped back, shaking her head. "That's not my concern." "It should be." Jackson moved closer, his voice low and urgent. "I'm asking permission to court you." Joe laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "Court me? Is this a joke? Did Victoria put you up to this for entertainment?" "I'm entirely serious." "You don't want me," Joe said, her voice breaking despite her efforts. "You want the story, the spectacle, the man who won the heart of the marked girl who tamed the monster horse. How noble, how dramatic." "That's not, isn't it?" Joe cut him off, anger burning through her chest. 6 weeks ago you didn't know I existed. Now, after everyone's talking about Diablo, after there's prestige in knowing me, suddenly you're interested? I may be unmarriageable, Mr. Wade, but I'm not stupid. Jackson's jaw tightened. "You think I'm that shallow?" "I think you're that human." Joe turned away. "Go back to Victoria. Marry someone appropriate. Leave me alone." "I can't." The raw honesty in his voice made her pause. "Because when I close my eyes, all I see is you walking into fire for a creature everyone else had given up on. And I realize something." Joe waited, her heart hammering. "I've been hiding my whole life," Jackson said quietly, "and you made me want to stop." Jackson stood in her father's parlor 3 days later, his hands shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists. The words came out halting and broken, his carefully controlled speech patterns completely shattered. "I have a stutter," he said, each syllable a battle. "Had it since I was 7. My father calls it a weakness. Victoria said she'd marry me if I fixed it first." Joe sat frozen in her chair, watching this polished, confident man come apart in front of her. Samuel Brennan had left them alone, sensing something important was happening. Now there was only silence except for Jackson's ragged breathing as he fought for words. "I learned to control it," Jackson continued, sweat beading on his forehead. "Slow speech, careful patterns, avoiding certain sounds. I've hidden it my whole life. But under stress, when I'm frightened or emotional, it comes back. Every time." He looked at her then, his eyes raw with vulnerability. "Victoria wanted me perfect, polished. She wanted the version of me that doesn't really exist. But you," his voice broke, "you walked into fire without hiding. You let everyone see your birthmark, your wounds, your truth. You never pretended to be anything other than exactly who you are." Joe felt something crack open in her chest. She thought of all the times she'd watched Jackson speak in town, his words smooth and measured. She'd assumed it was arrogance, confidence. Now she understood it was armor, just like hers. "That's why you watch me," she whispered. "Not because I'm a spectacle." Because you're brave, Jackson said simply. And I'm a coward who's been hiding behind careful words and his father's money. Joe stood, moving closer to him. You're not a coward. You're here. You're showing me the truth. I don't want to fix myself anymore, Jackson said, his stutter evening out as emotion steadied his voice. I want to be with someone who doesn't need me fixed, someone who understands that scars don't make us broken. Jackson. Joe reached out, her fingers touching his trembling hand. You need to be sure. Because if you choose me, you're choosing scandal, town gossip, your father's disappointment. People will say you've lost your mind, courting the marked girl from the failing ranch. Let them. Jackson's fingers closed around hers. I watched you risk everything for a horse everyone said was worthless. You proved them wrong. Maybe we can prove them wrong about us too. And if we can't, then at least I'll have stopped lying. Jackson pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to trace the birthmark on her face with infinite gentleness. This doesn't make you ugly, Joe. It makes you unforgettable. Outside, Diablo whinnied from his corral, the sound carrying through the open window. Joe thought about monsters and miracles, about the courage it took to be seen. All right, she said softly. You can court me. But Jackson? Yes? Never hide your voice around me, not ever. His smile was broken and beautiful. I promise. Choose the girl or choose your inheritance. You can't have both. The words carried through the open window of the Wade mining office where Joe stood frozen on the street below. She'd come to town for supplies, not to eavesdrop. But Jackson's father's voice was loud enough to shake the windows, and she couldn't make herself walk away. Father, please. Jackson's voice, steady, despite what she knew it cost him. That Brennan girl is a laughingstock, Marcus Wade snarled. Unmarriageable for good reason. And you've humiliated Victoria Ashford, whose father controls half the railroad contracts in this territory. Do you have any idea what you've cost us? I know exactly what I've cost us, Jackson replied quietly. And I'd do it again. Joe's hands trembled on her shopping basket. She should leave. This was private, but her feet wouldn't move. Then you're a fool, Marcus said. Victoria came to me this morning with her father. They're spreading rumors that the Brennan horse is still dangerous, that the girl used some kind of trickery or drugs to control it. They'll make sure every breeding contract gets canceled. They'll destroy that family, and you along with it if you persist in this madness. Let them try. Listen to me, boy. You have until Sunday to end this courtship and apologize to Victoria. If you don't, I'm cutting you off. No inheritance, no position in the company, nothing. You'll be as poor as that marked girl you're so fascinated by. Silence stretched long enough that Joe's heart nearly stopped. Then Jackson spoke, his voice clear and unwavering. Then I'll be poor. Joe pressed her hand to her mouth, tears blurring her vision. She turned and ran before either man could see her, her basket forgotten on the wooden sidewalk. She found Jackson an hour later at the Brennan Ranch, standing by Diablo's corral. The stallion stood calmly beside him, accepting the touch of Jackson's hand on his neck. When Jackson saw Joe approaching, his expression shifted to something raw and uncertain. You heard, he said. Not a question. I heard. Joe stopped a few feet away, her voice shaking. You can't do this, Jackson. You can't throw away your entire future for me. I won't be responsible for destroying your life. You're not destroying anything. Jackson moved toward her. My father is. Victoria is. They're the ones making this a choice between love and money. And you're choosing me? Joe's voice broke. Why? We've known each other barely 2 months. You don't owe me this sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice if I'm finally choosing what I actually want. Jackson took her hands in his. My whole life I've done what was expected. Spoken carefully. Courted the right girl. Followed the path my father laid out. And I was miserable, Joe. Every single day, I was dying inside that perfect, acceptable life. But your inheritance. Money can't buy what you've given me, Jackson said fiercely. The courage to stop hiding, the permission to be imperfect, to stutter and stumble and still be worthy of love. That's worth more than all my father's mines. Joe searched his face, looking for doubt or resentment. She found only determination. The wedding took place on a clear September morning with 20 guests and no apologies. Jo wore her mother's cream-colored dress, altered to fit her frame. She refused the veil her father offered, leaving her birthmark visible for everyone to see. Jackson stood waiting under the cottonwood tree beside the rebuilt barn, wearing a simple suit instead of his usual fine clothes. His hands shook slightly, but his smile was steady. Samuel Brennan walked his daughter across the meadow where Diablo grazed peacefully nearby, the stallion's black coat gleaming in the sunlight. The guests were mostly ranch hands and a few neighbors who'd known Jo since childhood. Marcus Wade had not come. Victoria Ashford and her father had left Montana the week before, their sabotage exposed when a ranch hand admitted they'd paid him to spread lies about Diablo's temperament. The preacher from town kept the ceremony short. When he asked Jackson to speak his vows, the words came with a slight stutter that Jackson didn't try to hide. "I promise to love you exactly as you are," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "To never ask you to hide or diminish yourself, to stand beside you when the world is cruel, and to remind you of your strength when you forget." Jo's throat tightened with tears. "I promise to see you fully," she said. "Not the version you think you should be, but the man you actually are. To celebrate your truth, not demand your perfection. To build a life where neither of us has to pretend anymore." They exchanged simple gold bands that Jackson had purchased with money from his first job as a ranch foreman. No inheritance, no mining fortune, just honest work and the promise of more. When the preacher pronounced them married, Jackson pulled Jo close and kissed her in front of everyone, his hand cradling the marked side of her face with deliberate tenderness. "Let them see. Let them all see." The small reception lasted until sunset. Jo and Jackson cut the cake her father had somehow afforded, danced to fiddle music played by one of the ranch hands, and accepted congratulations from people who genuinely wished them well. As darkness fell, they rode out together on Diablo and a paint mare named Sage. The stallion moved with complete trust beneath them, no longer the terrified, rage-filled creature from that midnight delivery. He was healed, not broken, never broken, just given the time and patience to remember what gentleness felt like. They stopped on the ridge overlooking the valley, the ranch lights twinkling below. Jackson's arm wrapped around Jo's waist, pulling her close against the evening chill. "Do you regret it?" Jo asked quietly. "Everything you gave up?" Jackson was silent for a moment, his stutter emerging as emotion swelled. "I gave up a life that was killing me," he said finally. "And I gained everything that matters." Jo leaned back against his chest, watching Diablo and Sage graze side by side in the meadow below. Two wounded souls who'd found each other. 4, if you counted the horses. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Jackson pressed a kiss to her temple, right over the birthmark. "We live," he said simply. "Exactly as we are." And in the vast Montana territory, under a sky full of stars, that was more than enough. If this story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow we have another powerful tale of courage and redemption waiting for you, because everyone deserves a story where being different becomes being unforgettable.